First of all, my name is Matthew Cuthbertson. I'm from your host, that being the Victorian division of the Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering. So, welcome. Thank you for coming on, I don't know, yet another beautiful autumn evening in Melbourne. And thanks for a few people who have joined us online. So before we begin the event, like all Academy meetings, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land we're meeting on today, and that's the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. And the Academy and all of us would like to acknowledge their elders, past, present, and emerging. So on that, I don't know, hopeful message, we move on to the topic of manufacturing in Australia. We have three terrific speakers for us, and just to explain to you how it will unfold, we've got a range of perspectives. So our keynote speaker is Karen Dobson, Chief Executive of Dow, Australia and New Zealand. So that's the big industry perspective, and then we've got two other perspectives from industry associations and thought leaders and advocates, and I'll call them influencers as well. They probably don't like that, but anyway. So that's the perspective. So we'll each hear from them. We'll hear from each of those, and then we'll open up the meeting for your discussion and questions and contributions. So let's start off and move to Karen. So Karen Dobson is a 35-year veteran of Dow. She joined as a graduate chemical engineer from the University of Melbourne, and now she's a managing director. And she has picked up some incredible experience along the way, managing a number of strategic global roles for Dow. And she's also had postings across Asia and in the United States. Apart from doing all that in Dow, Karen also holds a number of other significant positions. So she's chair of Chemistry Australia. She's a board member with the Business Council of Australia and also the Centre for Sustainable Engineering Innovation at the University of Queensland. And she is on the Advisory Council for the Australian Industry Group. And last but not least, Karen is also a newly minted fellow of the Academy. So Karen, congratulations, welcome, and tell us what's going to do. Thank you.
Thank you, Matthew. As Matthew mentioned, this is actually my first formal event with FTSE since being admitted as a fellow last October. And a quick shout out to Sandra, who invited me to be here today. I'm really proud to be here together with Louise and Sam, who I've worked with through the industry for a number of years. I do recognise that I'm in a room full of experts. Is quite humbling. And so I would just reinforce that this is a perspective, and I really look forward through the panel and the discussion to have some healthy exchange of views. So thinking back really over the last 3 decades, through the lens of a career in global manufacturing, I have 2 observations. Firstly, that manufacturing in Australia has never faced greater headwinds. And secondly, as a consequence, I think the role of industry associations and learned academies like FTSE has never been more important in engaging our policymakers with factual, informed advice that's free from ideology. There is a concerning disconnect between the well-intentioned rhetoric around a revival of manufacturing in Australia and the reality of what's occurring on the ground in the sector. It is for sure encouraging that we no longer have to argue for the importance of manufacturing, largely as a result of COVID. The role that manufacturing plays in achieving a strong and resilient economy is well acknowledged. Indices such as economic complexity are more commonly referenced. Even Australian Treasury notes the decline over the past decade in Australia's economic complexity, which tracks with the decline of manufacturing as a percent of GDP. With Australia now ranked 93rd out of 133 economies. declining 4 places in the last 5 years, below economies such as Uganda, Armenia, and Honduras. There is, from our perspective, a worrying lack of comprehension of what the manufacturing sector really is and how it operates, and how to effectively support it through policy. Sovereign manufacturing was a term popularized during COVID, and it did help shine a spotlight on manufacturing. And now again, new geopolitical disruption has forced countries to think about what they produce at home to shore up their domestic capability, as well as what they export and import. But we should be cautious about the term sovereignty, as it deflects from the real reasons for wanting to nurture a manufacturing economy. It's not about self-sufficiency. It's about security and resilience. Very few products are now made end-to-end in one location. Right? More than ever, manufacturing is a globally interconnected ecosystem. Companies up and down the value chain source their inputs from the most technically and commercially suitable supplier wherever they are. It's a dynamic ecosystem, as companies are constantly reevaluating their supply chains as they innovate and fight to remain competitive. If anything, Australia needs to be more outward-looking, not less. And it's not just for inputs, but also markets, right? We take for granted the necessity of serving global markets to achieve scale in our resources sector. And the same is true for manufacturing, particularly advanced manufacturing that requires large capital investments in technology, plant and equipment. Scale is vital for economic viability. Even when we talk about niche, high value-added components, our mindset needs to be made in Australia to supply the world, as well as the local market. And given that we're on the doorstep of Asia's middle-class population, which is expected to reach 3.5 billion in 5 short years, we're well placed to build scale. It's also important that manufacturing is perceived by our best and brightest talent as a place to develop a great career and achieve your life goals. We need to transform the perception of manufacturing from the factory floors and the assembly lines of the past to a modern and sophisticated ecosystem that is often at the forefront of adopting digital systems, robotics, and other advanced tools. Manufacturing includes everything from research, process technology, application development, global commerce, logistics, IT systems, not just production. For those who are motivated to help solve the world's greatest challenges, manufacturing is where technology is translated from the lab into products and systems and put to work on real-world problems. So we have seen welcome efforts in recent years by successive governments to revitalise manufacturing in Australia. The previous coalition's Modern Manufacturing Initiative evolved under Labor into the National Reconstruction Fund and the Future Made in Australia Act, released in April of last year. The intentions of these policy frameworks and the funding plans are really encouraging. And grants and incentives have a place. They're helpful for startups to get on their feet or businesses to get a project across the line as a bridge until they can anchor down into the ecosystem and build scale. But they are not effective on their own, right? Industry, in fact, often despairs at the waste of government funding allocated to aspirational areas that are fanciful at best, while existing manufacturers struggle to survive with punitive policy settings that undermine competitiveness. To illustrate the point and to contrast the US Inflation Reduction Act with the Future Made in Australia Act. So apart from scale, of course, a key difference is that the incentives under the US IRA, notwithstanding Trump's reconfiguration, are grounded in a strong foundation of competitive industry conditions. cheap and plentiful energy, a highly agile workforce, fit for purpose regulation, for example. So industry generally sees grants and incentives as nice to have, while the fundamental industry policy reform is essential to our future. So what is required to be competitive? In 2006, Michael Chaney, then president of the BCA, said, as a nation, we'll be condemned to confront the same reform barriers and economic imbalances every 10 to 20 years if we fail to address a number of key underlying issues. Now, he was talking at the time about reforms to tax, workplace relations, regulation, and red tape. And that was almost 20 years ago, and we're still talking about those same issues today. And we can now add to that list energy, climate, circularity, and skills. These are the issues that will define our long-term success as a country, and critically are the foundational requirements for restoring the conditions to be competitive and attract investment in manufacturing. We should be asking governments, in our view, to take bold steps in 5 broad policy areas that genuinely matter to ensure prosperity. Number 1, energy, right? Access to reliable, lowest cost energy, electricity and gas as we move toward net zero. Without them, industry will not be globally competitive nor have the capacity to invest. Gas is particularly critical for chemical feedstock and downstream manufacturing energy needs. Australia's East Coast gas market is dysfunctional. Despite what should be a competitive advantage from the abundance of reserves, domestic gas users remain effectively locked out of affordable and reliable supply. 3 market interventions have failed, including supply agreements, a voluntary and a mandatory code of conduct requiring initial price caps followed by reasonable contract provisions. The reality is the intended price cap is now effectively a floor price in negotiations. Gas retailers supplying most small and medium-sized industrial users have few checks and balances on their market power. These conditions contrast with the West Coast gas market, which is more functional while also managing the same domestic and export supply and demand dynamics. To illustrate this impact, analysis by the AI Group recently showed that since the pandemic, industrial prices are up 18%, but manufacturing inputs are up by 31%, and gas an astonishing 49%. In short, if we do not address the high cost of electricity and gas, much of the industrial manufacturing in Australia will become unviable. And we're already seeing recent closures of strategically important assets, which I'll come to shortly, which is a tragically perverse outcome for an energy-rich nation. Number 2, regulation. Unnecessary, inconsistent, complex, duplicative, overly burdensome regulation adds to the costs of business. It's also a major disincentive to investment because it increases uncertainty and delays projects. Manufacturers observe that while other economies globally roll out the red carpet, Australia rolls out the red tape. And unfortunately, the situation is not improving. It's actually getting worse as every level of government seeks to impose their own, often conflicting red and green tape, making it harder for manufacturers to operate, let alone justify new investments. A balance really needs to be restored. And we can look to Europe to see the consequence of overregulation as Europe is learning from that and is now trying to course correct. Number 3, skills and the future workforce. Manufacturing requires a variety of skilled employees, obviously engineers, scientists, technicians, and other STEM qualified individuals, but also economics and commerce, international trade, logistics, and other business qualifications. While skilled migration will always remain part of the solution for Australia, this is increasingly difficult as we are competing with other countries who are also seeking the same skills that we need. And I know I'm speaking to the converted here, but we must do better in developing a training pipeline of skilled workers right here in Australia, where the education sector and industry are better synchronised. Number 4 is tax. With its combination of state and federal taxes on income, land, employment, Australia is a relatively high tax economy for manufacturers. A competitive tax environment is just as important to drive investment as competitive energy and labour inputs. And targeted tax incentives can indeed help drive investment decisions, but fundamentally, our tax system is crying out for real reform. And number 5, not the least, is industrial relations. Workplaces need to be responsive to the future of work. They must enable innovation, ingenuity, and collaboration, and offer a clear reward for effort. Our country needs a modern and balanced workplace relations system that lifts performance, encourages flexibility, and allows wages to rise with productivity. So where are we as a nation? I see a few shaking of heads on these fundamental things that really underpin our competitiveness. Rather than feeling confident, many believe that we are losing our way and sliding backwards. We've had a decade-long stagnation of living standards because of our inability to grow the economy and drive up productivity. Our performance compared to other rich nations, quite frankly, is dismal. So instead of taking the hard decisions on the things that matter, we've taken incremental but noticeable steps backwards. Right? A steady raft of action and inaction across these foundational policy areas is resulting in reduced competitiveness of our nation. And the upshot is that major strategically important manufacturers are shutting down or actively choosing to invest overseas rather than here in Australia. Some examples: in the last year or so, the closures we've seen: Qenos, their operations in both Altona and Botany, Australia's only manufacturer of polyethylene, with the loss of their steam crackers, shut down, which has created a gap in our domestic capability for high-value circular plastics. Indorama Ventures Oxides, formerly Huntsman, Australia's only manufacturer of ethylene oxide and non-ionic surfactants, which have a wide range of applications, including agriculture, mining, home care hygiene, amongst many other sectors. Their facility in Botany shut down. Incitec Pivot, a major supplier of fertilizers for agriculture and technical grade urea, used in the manufacture of AdBlue for diesel engines, as well as a major source of CO2 for water treatment, medicinal, industrial use, and food and beverage production. Both their Gibson Island, Queensland facility and their Geelong facility shut down. While the loss of local manufacturing capability has been or will be replaced by imports, Australia's economic capacity, complexity, and supply chain resilience is eroded. And notably, the loss of gas feedstock-based chemical manufacturing cost Australia's GDP around $145 million per petajoule of gas. That's the value, that's the manufacturing value add versus selling a petajoule of LNG offshore. This isn't intended to be talking Australia down. It is a belief that we can and we must do better. Let me just touch on 3, to try to put a little bit more optimism, opportunity areas that are aligned to ATSE's objectives. Firstly, on Australia's transition to a more circular economy. right? A strong domestic manufacturing sector is required to realise a circular economy. The transition for plastics is already underway. Right? Investments are truly being made in materials, technologies, circular systems, and capacity building. Recycling is growing with increased recycled content in a range of applications. However, new markets for recycled content from these investments need to be created. And the supply and demand of circular materials needs to be coordinated with policymakers, research and academia, and consumers to create economic market demand. Success in this area is contingent on private sector investment, and unlocking this investment needs well-informed, unified, national circular economy policy frameworks and standards. And these should actually align with regional, within the APAC region, and global jurisdictions to ensure that we can close those capability gaps that we have, especially since our Australian manufacturing sector has already lost some of the capabilities required for closed loop circularity domestically. On climate change, right, the path to zero is particularly challenging for manufacturing, which has the paradox of being energy and emissions intensive while providing the materials and products necessary to decarbonize the broader economy. For manufacturers, it's not just about sourcing clean energy, which itself has some technical challenges, but about decarbonizing their actual production process. Abatement technologies are bespoke. They take time and money to develop, and they often can't be deployed until capital equipment reaches its end of life. Requiring safeguard facility operators to purchase emission offsets above their declining baseline diverts funds away from investment in actual emissions reduction technology, and it does increase the cost of the transition. A technology neutral approach, at the very least, is critical to enable the sector to deploy the most effective, lowest cost emissions reductions applicable to their particular operations. On research, translation, and commercialization, we would all agree that effective R&D commercialization is a powerful lever to reverse the trend of stagnating productivity. Manufacturing thrives in agile, well-functioning supply chains supported by good industry policy. And innovation thrives alongside manufacturing, right? Commercialization is not a single event, right? It is a continuous dynamic interplay from research to process development to production and scale up to market development and then feedback from field experience. Companies like Dow, where possible, co-locate their R&D with manufacturing because innovation is such a dynamic process that works through the end-to-end manufacturing system. So we should bear in mind, as we advise the Australian government in its strategic examination of our R&D system, that no amount of increased research funding will address the commercialization valley of death. And while there's actually no panacea for this, for bridging this gap, certainly a healthy manufacturing sector is a good enabler. So how do we go after the opportunities? You know, a big obstacle to real reform in not only Australia, actually, is the growing issue of populism. The cycle of populist short-term thinking has led to a cautious and incremental approach to policy change, rather than facing into the hard issues that will define our future. Current global economic and geopolitical disruption actually presents a window of opportunity for Australia, as we are somewhat insulated from the worst of these geopolitical effects. An opportunity for us to tackle the fundamental reforms while the world has pulled over as it waits for this storm to pass, halting investment, reassessing global relationships, and actually where to invest for the future. You know, capital is fleeing its usual safe haven, the US, looking for a new home, at least until the current volatility blows over. So now, post our federal election, there is a clear opportunity for the government in its second term to use its strengthened position in the Parliament to address the key challenges facing our economy and to push harder and further for real reform. The Treasurer has already highlighted that productivity will be his central second term priority. And while there is broad agreement on the need for productivity improvement and competitiveness, industry doesn't always agree with the government's economic strategy to achieve the productivity outcomes, particularly around industrial relations, the renewable energy rollout, and red and green tape issues. So collectively, we will need to be vocal and engage constructively throughout Labor's productivity agenda to ensure that our views are accounted for. I think for FTSE, as we provide strategic advice to policymakers and government, it's my view that we would do a great service to our country by educating those stakeholders on how the broad manufacturing ecosystem actually works, its integral value as a lever for productivity growth, and why fundamental policy reform is required to build and sustain a healthy manufacturing sector. So thank you all. Thank you, Matthew.
Well, manufactured in Australia and supplying the world. It was a great start. I thought we just have to do 5 really difficult things to get there. Anyway, thank you for that incredibly perceptive and wide-ranging talk. As I said at the beginning, we'll hold the discussion part until the end. So we now need to round out the discussion, if you will, with our 2 other panel members. So first to Louise. Louise is Head of Industry Development and Policy at the AI Group, Australian Industry Group. Louise also has 20 years experience in international trade, and she's represented Australia in multiple forums, including the B20 task forces, Global Business Coalition, and the East Asia Business Council. In her day job now at AI Group, she is about policy, and her focus is on concentrating on building competitive industries through global integration, infrastructure, and innovation. Louise, please tell us more. Louise and Samantha also will tell us a bit about their organisation also to start with, and then pick up one of the 82 things that Karen has pointed out to us already. Please.
Thank you very much, Matthew. So I'm Louise McGrath, Head of Industry Development and Policy at the Australian Industry Group. I'm sure many of you will know of AI Group and presumably have been a member at some time in your careers. We are 150 years old. Our history is in manufacturing, though, of course, as the Australian economy has evolved, so has our membership base, and it now is quite a wide church, really, including, transport, ICT, even the care economy, other members within the sort of broader industrial ecosystem, retail, sort of everything except minerals, sort of everything that you might find on the shelf. And as a membership organisation, we have a broad remit. My remit is within industry policy, and our team, which covers defence, digital policy, climate and energy, supply chain standards, and economics and research. We see our role as helping policymakers and businesses to address the 3 big challenges facing the Australian economy at the moment, which is digitalisation, decarbonisation, and diversification. And it seems that whatever area you might look at in terms of industrial policy, whether it's building codes, whether it's standards, whether it's plastics, packaging, food, those three things really are driving all this change. Artificial intelligence, everything. And as we help members, think about those 3Ds, we do a lot of work to ensure that they understand the regulations, and we do a lot of advocacy on those regulations, but also understand the opportunities. And so we do a lot of work, particularly on, AI and digitalization, to help inform members to understand what the opportunities are. We don't think everything should be considered a threat, but when we do see threats, of course, we do act in representing their interests. So further to Karen's excellent presentation, I often reflect that manufacturing as a word carries a heavy load, because it describes everything from making chairs to making rockets. And everyone thinks that they know what manufacturing is, but I'm pretty sure that everyone has a very different idea of what they're confident in what manufacturing is. And I fear, as Karen has indicated, that a lot of politicians just think manufacturing is hard hats and high vis. And I think a lot of general public in Australia, when I talk to people, because I spend a lot of time just convincing people that manufacturing exists in Australia, that manufacturing is just dirty, dull, and dangerous. And we do a lot of work to explain, well, no, it's actually, digitalized, increasingly decarbonised, and increasingly diversified. And if I think about, that word manufacturing and try to put industries and companies into sort of three very blunt, broad buckets to sort of help understand. So if we think about low intensity in terms of skills and innovation, so the sort of commodity level manufacturing, fasteners, nuts and bolts, those sorts of things. When we opened our economy, a lot of that moved offshore just because of our comparative advantage. Mid levels of technology and innovation, such as passenger car assembly, really struggled without extra government support because we're a small market and we weren't set up to export our cars. So that too has certainly leveled out over the years and certainly diminished. But the things you really care about in your car, like brake pads, like gearboxes, things where quality really matters, they are still made in Australia. And those high intensity in terms of skills and innovation, those manufacturers, they've not diminished. In fact, their exports have doubled over the last 20 years. And there's all sorts of examples, such as, as I said, those high tech things that you need in cars, anything you put in or on your body. So think about Cochlear, think about Ego Pharmaceuticals. There's a lot of products that we make in Australia that are world-class. When we think about Trump's tariffs, diversification is our big thing. Originally that was against China, but who knew it was going to be against our big ally. 22% of those elaborately transformed manufacturers to the world go to the US. Now, of course, they rely on Chinese inputs, just as their American competitors are. So we're now working with members to understand their supply chains and what that impact is, because it's not a homogeneous impact across all of industry. It really depends on your trading relationships, on your supply chains, who you're competing with, and what their supply chains look like. So I think I've probably got to my 5 minutes, Matthew, so I'm sorry. But I think as we go through the discussion, happy to talk more about these issues. We at AI Group are very passionate about manufacturing. We do a lot of deep research, as Karen said, and I forgot to add one last thing. The figures that Karen mentioned in terms of the shrinkage of our input costs, the expansion of our input costs, but the shrinkage of our profits has meant that Australian manufacturing at the moment is technically in recession. So notwithstanding my very positive comments at the start.
Well, thank you, Louise. I'm glad it's only a technical recession, but anyway, so be it. The last of our panelists to introduce themselves is Samantha Reid. Samantha's Chief Executive of Chemistry Australia. And like our other speakers, she's been around a while. She's had 3 decades of experience. across a lot of technology-intensive industries that are dear to all of our hearts. She's worked in plastics, chemicals, renewable fuels, automotive and steel. Previously, she was the Chief Executive of Biofuels Association of Australia and a Senior Executive at GM Holden in a number of different roles. She's also had board position with GM Holden and also with the Federal Chamber of Automotive Industries. So Samantha's passion is building sustainable and resilient businesses and communities, and recognises that for Australia, our manufacturing base and our industrial base is a critical part of building those sustainable communities. So welcome, Samantha.
Thank you, Matthew. And certainly, thank you for having me here tonight. It's certainly a topic that I have lived and breathed, as Matthew said, for more than 30 years. But let's talk a little bit about the organisation that I'm currently CEO of. So Chemistry Australia represents the chemicals and plastics industry in Australia. And our mandate is to promote the conditions required for growth, for jobs and investment in the industry and its value chains. So our work is very heavily focused on policy and also the regulatory environment in which our industry operates. But we also focus our efforts on building capability and trust within our industry through programs such as Responsible Care. We have a recently established Emerging Leaders program, and we have a significant scholarship which we provide in partnership with Chief Executive Women for a Woman Leader in STEM to attend the Oxford Business School's Women Transforming Leadership. Our membership is 98 organisations and growing, I'm pleased to say. And they're spread across manufacturing, distribution, transport and logistics, universities and research, as well as service providers to the industry. And I have to put in a plug tonight. We have also just launched the opportunity for individuals working in the industry, its supply chains, certainly in university, working in technology and research, to actually join as a personal member of Chemistry Australia, be part of what we're trying to do and to contribute to our efforts to improve the policy settings in Australia for investment in our industry and the wider industry. We have been expanding over the last few years, so we operate two other related industry associations, the Australia New Zealand Industrial Gas Association, which is a bit of a mouthful. So the industrial gas sector is critically important to many supply chains. If you think about our medical supply chain, water, for example, very important. The Australian Paint Manufacturers Federation is also an organisation that we operate. And internationally, we partner now with the Global Silicons Council and the International Bromine Federation, and we support them with their global regulatory work. And 7 years ago, Chemistry Australia established with a group of members the Australian Modern Building Alliance, which is focused on the safe and sustainable use of polymers in building and construction, particularly to promote energy efficiency in residential applications. So as CEO of Chemistry Australia, I represent a strategically significant industry. I like to call it an industry of industries. You often hear steel and aluminium described in those terms, but the chemical and plastic sector is equally an industry of industries. We provide inputs to 108 of A recent report we commissioned with ACL Allen has shown that over the last 5 years, the industry in Australia has grown, although it has fallen as a percentage of our GDP. And unfortunately, as we've heard from Karen tonight, we have seen a decline in the local manufacture of chemicals and plastics, consistent with the overall decline we've seen over the last 10 to 20 years in manufacturing, which was, I don't know, gosh, once 13, 14, 15%. It's now down to 5 to 6%, which is very concerning. And we've heard tonight, high energy costs, inefficient regulation, declining productivity, skill shortages, our tax policy are making Australia an unattractive place for investment. And the settings impact our current industries, as Karen talked about, and it's going to impact any future industries we aspire to have. Karen talked a lot about the fact that over the last 10 years, Australia's become an LNG exporter alongside our other key resources such as iron ore and critical minerals. And I suppose inevitably, a linkage of our gas market to the international market has seen over that time prices rise 4 to 5 times. So where input costs for a polyethylene facility may have been for gas around $3 petajoule, almost impossible to get anything under $12, $14 today. And I won't go into the closures again, but that has resulted in a string of closures in our industry, but also in other sectors. We're looking at, look at Oceanic Glass, you look at Whyalla, you look at companies in the food sector who have closed over recent years. And with each closure, there is increased risks that flow through the supply chain. So often customers will then switch to an import model. So downstream customers are switching to an import model, which means higher working capital due to the increase in safety stocks. It changes an organisation's cash flow due to the fact that you're shipping goods and the timing of payments may change. There can be reduced responsiveness. You've got, if you've got a supplier down the road, you might have a week's supply. You're then looking at potentially 10-week lead time. So how flexible and responsive can you be? And there's also a potential more, which is the most concerning thing, that as parts of your inputs start to disappear from Australia, that the remaining manufacturers, look at their business model and say, you know what, it makes more sense for us to move offshore closer to our inputs or closer to our customers. So I often talk about this and say it's a bit like Jenga. You start pulling out the pieces of the supply chain, it all starts to collapse. And I think an important theme here is the interconnectedness. Now, Karen talked about the fact that the global industry is extremely interconnected now and the way manufacturing has changed, but domestically, it's even heightened because there are a lot of outputs that become inputs for other manufacturers. And, there's that risk that you bring in. And when we talk to government, I think one of my concerns is that there is a lack of appreciation of those linkages and risks. And I get quite disheartened at times that it feels like when you're talking to the key departments that there is a feeling of inevitability and acceptance in some cases. And we take more of a crisis management approach to dealing with this rather than stepping back and saying, hey, this is strategically significant for the economy. We need to take a different approach, not just react and work out, how we're going to, feed supply and make sure everyone's okay for the next 3 months. So I have been encouraged because certainly the Federal Industry Department has set aside some resources to look at the strategic issues that are at play here, and we hope to be working with them in the coming months on critical supply chains and identifying those critical nodes and related manufacturers that we cannot afford to lose. It's great to see the ambition of the Labor government. And at one point I was sitting back as we were developing our policy priorities saying, I am so disappointed that Australia doesn't have ambition beyond exporting our raw materials. But the government has tried to do that by putting forward significant funding in the form of the National Reconstruction Fund, in the form of Future Made in Australia. and we can talk about this a bit more, I think, on the panel, but certainly while these funds can be useful for organisations, that's not why people, and that's why a lot of mobile global capital is not coming to Australia, because it's because of those uncompetitive settings. And we're missing out on billions, trillions of dollars of investment from the global chemical and plastics industry, who are at the forefront of R&D and innovations around the world to support transition to net zero and circular economies. So one last thing, I'm currently very pleased to be involved as a mentor for the Global Creative Destruction Lab program, which has been hosted in Australia at the Monash Business School. And I have a keen interest in how we successfully transition our startups and our tech companies to mid-sized Australian manufacturers. You know, certainly there's VC funding out there and it's good up to a point, but when you get to that pilot or commercialization stage and you're looking for significant investment, that's where you hit the barrier. And the venture capital funds will invest, but they'll be telling businesses, go and put your business offshore. It's too risky. We're not going to fund it if you're going to locate in Australia. So I will finish by noting Chemistry Australia's recent priorities for the election for the government, which we will continue to progress, and Karen discussed. We need access to reliable, lowest cost, low emission energy. We need to address our declining productivity, our skill shortage, our inefficient regulation. We need targeted tax incentives to encourage investment. And we need to support our industries to achieve net zero and to transition to a more circular economy. So thank you very much for having me. I look forward to the ongoing discussion.
All right, now we need to close in a moment, unfortunately. But remains for me to do two jobs. The first is the commercial for the next one of these seminars. It's on the 3rd of June. Now, on that evening at 6 o'clock for fellows only, there is the formal annual meeting for the Victorian division. But at 6:30, we have a seminar from Daniel Westerman, who's the Chief Executive of AEMA, the Australian Energy Market Operator. And Daniel's talk is Transformation of Australia's Energy Sector. So I think Daniel can pick up a few tips from this evening on that one. So I'd just like to close by thanking our speakers. I think all three of them have demonstrated their, I guess, amazing depth and breadth and knowledge and strategic perspective. They've also demonstrated their terrific passion for the topic. So I applaud them all for that. But in terms of, I don't know, what I'll remember, I think, I don't know, Samantha, you talked a lot about gas and just these little molecules and how far they get and how important it is. And, you know, we can't even get the East Coast and the West Coast right. So we've got a bit of work to do on gas. I took that away. Louise, I thought, I really like your 3 Ds. I think challenges in manufacturing, digital, diversify, and decarbonize. I really like that. I didn't like the other 3 Ds very much, dirty, dull, and dangerous. And Karen, I don't really know where to begin. You have touched on so many important things and left us so many messages to think about. I don't think I'll have the temerity to try to sum that up, but thank you all. Thank you. And please, again, show your appreciation to our 3 speakers.